get rid of any false pictures that get in the way of us seeing the truth about you. And help us get rid of any false pictures that get in the way of us seeing the truth about who you've created us to be. In Jesus' name. Amen. Sometimes, I don't know if anybody else has this trouble, but sometimes I think we have trouble believing when someone says yes. That sometimes I get worried, I get anxious, and I'm uncertain, and I know I need to ask somebody to help with something, but I think I need to come up with this really good argument. So I plan ahead of time how I can convince the person that they need to help me. And so often I'll start talking to someone and they'll say yes right away. But I've got my speech so planned that I just keep on talking and I don't really hear them say yes. And it drives me crazy when other people do that to me. There are certain people that when I talk to them, I'll say, okay, yeah, I can do that. And they continue on with their argument trying to convince me why I need to help them. And sometimes you think, well, did you not hear me when I said yes? Or did you not believe me when I said yes? I think when we look at the Christian life, in many cases, God must be up there saying, didn't you hear me when I said yes? But yet we feel like we need to keep on our practiced or our well-prepared argument as to why God should love us or why we should have access to God. When God says, didn't you hear me a while ago? I said yes. You have access. And that's what Paul's writing about in our reading from Romans today. That we have access. It's not we might have access or we could have access. It's we have access. We have access through faith to our redemption. We have access to God's grace in which we stand. So now the question is not how do we figure out how to get access to God, but it's how do we actually learn how to live in the reality that we do have access to God. I think that he's up there just shaking his head saying, you don't get it, do you? The Christian life is not meant to be a whole bunch of hard work of trying to come up with a good resume, trying to come up with a good argument. I said yes already from the cross. Did you not hear me? Don't you believe what I said? It's interesting to see where Paul goes, though. I always thought it was weird, the progression in Romans 5. Because you have access to God's grace in which you stand. And then all of a sudden it starts talking about suffering. And I'm thinking, well, why do you have to throw that in? I'm just appreciating that I can be in God's grace. But I think it sort of makes sense that what Paul has discovered is that when you do stand in God's grace, when you actually are in a place where you have his resources and his love, that instead of being destroyed by struggles, that those struggles actually make you stronger. So that because I'm standing in God's grace, because I have access to his resources, that even my suffering, even in my struggles, does not drive me further away from God. But there are opportunities where it goes, and this I thought was weird where they placed this in Romans 5. For God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, whom God has given us. So what does that have to do with all these struggles? I think it's Paul saying, you know what, in the struggles you're going to get access to things about God and God's love that you wouldn't have if it weren't for those struggles. So it's like in the midst of all those things, because you stand in God's grace, because he already has said yes to you, even the difficult times, we can rejoice in those because it develops character. It develops strength of who we are. And it gives God opportunities to pour out his love and grace into our lives in different ways. So, access to his grace. I mean, really that's what I want to talk about today is how do we have that access if it's not that we've come up with a really good argument or put together a really good resume so that we can find our own access to God? Well, I think as I read the Bible, the whole message is not that we ever need to find our own access to God, but that God has come to make access for us. So he brings it to us, but when do we get access to God's grace? And that's where the next little part of what Paul writes. Okay, you stand in God's grace so that even in difficult times you can experience God's love and grace. So let me tell you when you got access. While you were weak, that's when you got access. Not when you didn't have any clout for you to earn access, that's when he gave it to you. While you were sinners, That's when Christ chose to die for you. So before you fixed everything and cleaned everything up and made yourself look good, that's when he gave you access. But then he goes even a step further, saying that while you were enemies of God, while you were raging at God and yelling at God and frustrated with God and disappointed with God, that's when he gave you access. It's pretty amazing that almost, and I think this is true, I think that the truth is that he wants us to have access to him even more than we want to have access to him. And he's paid the price to make it possible. So he's up there saying yes to us while we keep on arguing, trying to convince him whether we can come in. And he's just saying, you know what, there's a place at my table. If you can ever slow down enough to just come and sit down with me, come and sit down. So in John chapter 4, just to see an example of how God works, Jesus has just said in John 3 that he didn't come to condemn, but he came to save. So here we get an example of his priorities, that right after that we get into John 4, and the first thing he does is he heads out, and the verses before this, it says that he says to his disciples, it's necessary that we go through Samaria. And if you were a Jewish person, would you ever hear those words, it's necessary we go through Samaria? No, they would do anything. They would add days to their travels to make sure they didn't go through Samaria. So Jesus says, this is my priority. We need to go through Samaria because he knows he's got an appointment set there that will match his agenda for ministry. So he gets to Samaria, they come to a well, the disciples go into town to find food, and Jesus has found the one that he's looking for. The one who basically doesn't feel like she has access to anything. She's a Samaritan, so why are you talking to me as a Jew? And not only does she not feel like she should have access to him, but she probably doesn't feel like she has access to her community either. She's had sort of a checkered past. Why is she going to the well at noon in the first place? As if you were a respected woman in the city, you'd go out to the well in the morning when it's cool still. So there's something about, she probably doesn't feel like she belongs anywhere. And what does Jesus do? He starts talking to her. He starts recognizing her. He starts valuing her. And before long, the thing that's so amazing to me is he knows everything about her. He knows all the junk about her and everything. But somehow, even as he shares that he has perfect knowledge of all the dirt in her life, she feels more connected to God after encountering him than she did before. What would it be like if the church had that effect on our world? Where we could acknowledge the guilt and the junk and the shame and the sin, and still have people feel more loved after talking to us than they felt before they knew that we knew all this stuff about them. I think there's something about the call of who we are, to be people who give access to people, not because they're perfect, not because they have everything figured out, but to be a place where people get access to love and grace because that's who we are. And that's how Jesus did his ministry. So I want to encourage you to look at where you're at in that conversation. Have you still got your well-practiced argument that you're trying to convince God that he should love you and forgive you? Are you still going ahead and continuing your little monologue, your little speech? Or have you actually heard him say yes? And if you have heard him say yes, do you actually believe him? Because really that's the adventure of the Christian life, is what does it look like to believe that he said yes? And to actually learn how to come into his presence. So, where are you at in that? Are you still trying to make yourself look good? Are you still trying to pretend that you did everything right? Are you still, as if somehow you could hide, I'm going to pretend that I didn't do that sin, as if God somehow will not see it if we hide it well enough. We don't need to hide it. We don't need to keep arguing. We don't need to try to keep convincing God. He knows the sin. He knows our weakness. He knows when we're mad at him. He knows when we're frustrated. And what does he choose to do at that moment through the cross? Here's access. You can stand in my grace. You can stand in my love. And in the good times, we can rejoice together. And in the difficult times, you're going to experience things of my grace that you never imagined you could experience. Amen.